About 10,000 years ago, the great ice caps that covered much of Britain began to thaw. Huge torrents of meltwater gouged out mighty valleys, leaving behind a network of rivers that are familiar today. And it was along these natural lines of communication that the earliest permanent settlers of Britain made their way. High ground on the east bank of the mighty Severn soon proved attractive, and Neolithic and Bronze Age remains have been discovered in the Worcester region. By the year zero, a thriving, strongly fortified Iron Age settlement of the Dubuni people existed in the Lichgate area, overlooking a shallow stretch of tidal river that could be forded at low tide. When the legions of the Roman Emperor Claudius conquered Britain in 43 AD, they quickly recognized the strategic importance of the site and built a fort here. In the early part of the occupation, the region saw a great deal of military activity as the legions tried to subdue the British tribes in the hills across the river. Once their new province was secure, a large residential suburb grew outside the fort in the Deansway area, and industry, particularly iron smelting, flourished in the area. Local production of iron was far greater than demand, and large quantities, along with salt from Droitwich, were exported from a Roman harbour at Diglis. This would have been a thriving cultural melting pot of people from all over the Roman world, all bringing their customs and beliefs with them. It was in this way that Christianity arrived here. After the Roman Emperor Constantine adopted the faith early in the 4th century, churches appeared throughout their vast empire, and evidence of a Roman church and cemetery has been uncovered on the site of today's cathedral. By the early 4th century, Rome itself was under threat from marauding pagan hordes from Germany, and withdrew its forces from Britain to defend the homeland. A new invader was quick to take advantage of the situation, and tribes of Angles, Saxons and Jutes conquered Kent, then began pushing the Romano-British population further and further west, and eventually across the Severn into what became known as Wales, from Wheelus, Anglo-Saxon for foreigners. The tribe that occupied the old Roman town were a mixture of Anglians and Saxons called the Wicca. The settlement became known as Wiccaesster, Cester indicating a former Roman town. In time, Wiccaesster was corrupted to Worcester. Christianity was swept away by the newcomers, and as they worshipped pagan gods like Woden and Chew, the old Romano-British churches crumbled. The Wiccan kingdom was later absorbed by the mighty Saxon kingdom of Mercia, and Christianity returned in the late 7th century, when missionaries were sent from Northumbria to undertake the conversion of the Mercians, building a wooden church in Worcester on the site of today's cathedral. When the town was chosen as the seat of the Bishop of West Mercia, the little wooden church was elevated to cathedral status, and Bosel, a monk from Whitby Abbey, elected as first Bishop of Worcester. The Saxon town occupied much the same area as the Roman one, bordered by the river and the high street, but its new importance saw Worcester begin to expand. In 867, a new breed of invader burst onto Britain's shores when a huge Danish army landed in East Anglia and began their rampage across the country, reducing Mercia to a shadow of its former self and threatening to overrun England completely. Alfred the Great of Wessex stemmed the Viking advance, and by the late 9th century had begun to recover some of the lost land. In 890, Worcester was refounded as a borough, a fortified town designed to act as a fortress against Danish raids, a safe market for the surrounding countryside, and an administrative centre for the area. Encouraged by King Alfred, Ethelred of Mercia built new earthen defences and increased the size of the city. A church was established next to the gate that allowed access to Worcester from Wales. It was dedicated to no particular saint, all saints in fact, so as to be acceptable to all comers. The town escaped the worst excesses of the Viking invasion and continued to expand, with trade as far afield as London possible. The wealth generated financed the construction of the first bridge over the Severn here, and the construction of a new cathedral. In 961, Bishop Oswald built a new stone church next to Bosel's wooden one, and also founded a Benedictine monastery that would play a major role in Worcester life for the next 6 centuries. Shortly after his death in 992, Oswald was canonised and his shrine became a place of pilgrimage, increasing Worcester's religious importance and its prosperity. A prosperity that made it an attractive target for a new generation of Vikings. In 1041, an army of marauding Danes pillaged Worcester and inflicted serious damage on the cathedral and monastery. According to local folklore, one of the raiders struggling to remove the cathedral's heavy Sanctus bell missed the boat, literally, and the townsfolk returned to catch the lone Dane red-handed. In angry retribution, they skinned him alive, and we're told lined the cathedral's great west door with his hide. In the mid-19th century, the grisly legend was given credence when a piece was analysed and proved to be human. The struggle for the throne between Danes and the English finally ended in 1066 with the defeat of King Harold by William the Conqueror at Hastings. The Normans set about securing their new kingdom with a network of hastily erected motte and bailey castles at strategic points, including one at Worcester, alongside the cathedral to guard the river crossing. Under Norman rule, most of the Old English elite, including church leaders, were deposed in favour of Frenchmen. One rather surprising exception was in Worcester, where Wulfstan, bishop at the time of the invasion, was allowed to retain his post. He had been friend and confidant to Edward the Confessor and supported Harold in his claim to the throne, yet still managed to convince King William of his loyalty to the new regime, and remained the only English bishop in 11th century England. In 1084, aged 76, he embarked on the building of a grand new cathedral, on the site of Bosel's wooden church and Oswald's stone one, although he apparently wept at their destruction. Wulfstan died in 1095 while his new structure was taking shape, and 18 years later a disastrous fire swept through the building, leaving the crypt as the only substantial Norman remains. It survives today as the largest Norman crypt in England. As a magnificent new cathedral began to rise from the ashes of Wulfstan's church, Worcester continued to expand, and all but 2 of the city's 10 medieval parish churches existed to serve the needs of the growing suburbs. Housing had also spread across the river, and a thriving medieval town evolved on high ground on the west bank. In 1203, Bishop Wulfstan was canonised and his tomb took pride of place alongside St Oswald's in the cathedral. Stories of miracles taking place at the saint's tomb spread like wildfire, bringing pilgrims from far and wide. All needed food, lodgings, and of course a souvenir of their visit, and a huge tourist industry grew around Worcester's 2 saintly bishops. In 1216, the tombs of Oswald and Wulfstan were joined by that of another eminent historical figure. King John's 17-year reign was a stormy one, to say the least. He had lost his continental estates to King Philip of France, been excommunicated by the Pope, and forced by rebel barons to sign Magna Carta. The troubled monarch had venerated St Wulfstan, and on his deathbed ordered that he be buried in Worcester Cathedral. His stone coffin was laid before the high altar, and a few years later surmounted by an effigy carved from Purbeck marble. This is the oldest royal effigy in England. By now, Worcester Castle had been rebuilt in stone with a new, hugely impressive entrance, which still stands today. The castle was the residence of the Earl of Worcester, while the bishop occupied a comfortable palace a short distance from the cathedral. The city had long since spilled over the old Saxon defences, and work started on a new city wall enclosing a much larger area, with a number of fortified gateways providing access to the expanding metropolis. Watergate led from the castle to the river, where a ferry took passengers to the west bank. The ferryman's cottage stood above the gate. The extension of Worcester's boundaries saw new streets laid out, and the marketplace moved to a new location just within the city walls. The city's burgeoning wealth owed a great deal to the expanding cloth trade that was jointly controlled by a Trinity Guild and a Dominican friary that once occupied part of the site of the Crown Gate Centre. Another important local trade was that in salt. Since Roman times, salt from Droitwich had been a regular cargo on the Severn. Castle Street was originally known as Salt Street, since it was created in fields outside the city walls by merchants to provide direct access to the quayside without having to pass through Worcester, so avoiding the heavy tolls payable. The River Severn by now was one of the busiest trade routes in the country, and Worcester's quays were busy with ships unloading goods from the Midlands and north of England, and loading goods for the south and as far afield as France, Germany and southern Spain. Not that negotiating the Severn was entirely hazard-free. The river was still tidal, and sandbars known as catches or ketches in the local dialect built up at certain points and could easily trap an inexperienced skipper. One particularly treacherous ketch was at Clerkenleap and gave its name to the pub. A particular type of vessel evolved to cope with the conditions on the Severn. The Severn Trows were a direct descendant of the shallow Viking ships that had brought destruction centuries earlier. Each Trow cargo swelled the coffers of the city's merchants who built houses that reflected their growing wealth. Typical of these grand dwellings is the building that is now the Pheasant Inn. This was the area for Worcester's commercial elite, while at the other end of the scale were the narrow medieval streets and alleyways of the old town, packed with the homes and workshops of the weavers. The first half of the 16th century was also notable for the seismic changes in England's religious structure, instigated by Henry VIII. A chain of events that started in 1502 when Prince Arthur, eldest son of Henry VII, died at Ludlow Castle, aged just 15, having recently married Catherine of Aragon. The prince was buried at Worcester, where an ornate chantry chapel was built to house his tomb. Prince Arthur's younger brother, Henry, obtained special dispensation from the Pope to marry Catherine of Aragon, and in 1509 inherited the English throne. The marriage was initially a happy one, but failed to produce the son Henry thought essential to succeed him, and the king sought the Pope's permission to divorce Catherine. Refusal led to Henry creating the Church of England, with no influence from Rome and himself as head, giving him the right to grant his own divorce. Any institution with papal allegiances became targets of the new order. In Worcester, the Dominican friary and the Benedictine monastery were both dissolved, and the tombs of Oswald and Wulfstan, with their obvious symbolism, destroyed. Henry VIII founded a grammar school known as King's School in the former monastery buildings. Henry VIII's great desire to produce a male heir ultimately proved fruitless. His only son, the sickly Edward VI, died young, leaving Henry's two daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, to fight for the throne. Elizabeth eventually triumphed, and as Elizabeth I, paid Worcester a visit. While here, she granted a charter to the school founded in the 13th century by the Trinity Guild. This was the forerunner of the Royal Grammar School. The 17th century saw England plunge headlong into a civil war that severely disrupted Worcester's trade and saw the city play a central role in the bloodiest conflict ever fought on British soil. After years of unrest between Parliament and King Charles I, in 1642 the two sides went to war, and Worcester was to witness both the very first skirmish and the final battle. Shortly after the declaration of war, Charles I was stationed at Shrewsbury, and Sir John Byron was trying to deliver silver plate to the king from Oxford. He was pursued by parliamentarian cavalry led by Colonel Fines, who caught up with Byron at Worcester. King Charles sent his nephew, Prince Rupert, with a detachment of royalist troops to the rescue, and the two clashed at Powick Bridge on the outskirts of Worcester. Rupert won the ensuing skirmish, and 50 Roundheads died in these fields, the first of many casualties of the Civil War. The Royalists returned to Shrewsbury with Byron and the silver plate, while the parliamentarians withdrew to Worcester, stabling their horses in the cathedral. The city later fell to the Royalists, who, despite a number of attempts to win it back, held it until the king's defeat in 1649. Charles II, meanwhile, had taken refuge in Scotland, where he raised a 14,000-strong army from Scottish and English Royalists, and in July 1651 marched south towards London. Cromwell forced the Royalists west, and in August, after being repelled from Shrewsbury, they came to a surprisingly lightly defended Worcester, where Charles set up his standard. By now, Cromwell had reached Evesham, 16 miles away. His army was 30,000 strong, more than double the king's force, and still growing. Back in Worcester, Charles set up his headquarters in the commandery, and as Cromwell closed in on the city, began to prepare for the inevitable clash. The king stationed the bulk of his army at the apex of a triangle bordered by the Team and the Severn. He also kept a reserve of cavalry at the ready on Pitchcroft, and left a rear guard of Scots at Powick Church south of the river. Finally, a battery of cannon was sighted on the hill, now known as Fort Royal. Cromwell decided on a three-pronged attack. He collected boats from up and down the Severn to be used as bridging pontoons, one to cross the Team and another the Severn. The third point of attack would be Fort Royal from Perrywood and Redhill. Fighting began on the morning of the 3rd of September 1651. As the first Roundhead party approached the River Team, they met fierce resistance from the rear guard Charles had left at Powick Church. After fighting a strong delaying action, the Scots were forced back to Powick Bridge and overrun. Eventually, the Parliament force crossed at both bridging points, and by mid-afternoon the battle was raging all along the Team. Gradually, the Royalists were pushed back across these fields, hedge by hedge and step by bloody step towards Worcester, where King Charles directed operations from the cathedral tower. Cromwell was waiting near the Ketch Inn with a substantial force of men. When the time was right, he crossed the Severn himself and broke through the outnumbered Royalists, who fell back into Worcester. Things looked bleak for the royal cause, but from his vantage point, Charles saw that the parliamentarian army was in two sections, with no way of joining up quickly. Descending from the tower, he mustered every soldier he could at short notice, and personally led a charge. Sweeping all before him, he captured the important parliamentarian positions on Redhill and Perrywood, which shifted the key area of the battle, giving Charles the advantage. Cromwell led his men back across the Severn and flung them at the king's new position. After 3 hours of bitter conflict, Parliament again had the upper hand. The king could no longer rally his cavalry, and as darkness approached, they deserted, leaving the infantry to their fate. All Charles could do now was save himself. He came to this house, owned by the royalist Berkeley family, and escaped through the adjacent St Martin's Gate, the only city gate not in Parliament's hands. Soon after, Worcester was completely overrun by Cromwell's men, and as darkness fell, horrific scenes took place as the faithful city was made to suffer for its support of the king. 1,000 Scottish soldiers were slaughtered here in the shadow of the cathedral, and elsewhere men, women and children were massacred. A bloody end to a war that had torn England apart. As England recovered from this devastating period, trade on the Severn resumed, and Worcester continued its prosperous march forward. 1690 saw the appearance of a Worcester institution that has certainly stood the test of time. Barrow's Worcester Journal first saw the light of day as the Worcester Postman, and is still being printed, the world's oldest continuously published newspaper. The events of the Civil War weren't entirely forgotten, and when the majestic Guildhall was built in 1724, not only did it bear statues of the two Charlies, but also a representation of Cromwell's head, irreverently pinned up by his ears. In 1751, Dr. John Wall, an eminent local surgeon, and William Davis, an apothecary, perfected a recipe for making soft-paste porcelain in Worcester, laying the foundations for another of the city's great institutions. Dr. Wall raised £4,500 to finance the first factory at Walmstree House near the cathedral, and the 15 investors were all sworn to keep the recipe secret. Porcelain manufacture was in its infancy in Britain, and the Worcester firm soon gained a reputation for producing high-quality wares. In the same year, the 75-foot tower of St Andrew's Church, one of Worcester's famous landmarks, was created when the church was rebuilt. By now, glove making had taken over from the cloth trade in the old weavers' quarters that occupied the Crown Gate site. St Andrews served this crowded working community, and the spire became known as the Glover's Needle. The church itself was demolished in the 1940s, leaving the spire teetering precariously on its hillock. The Severn was still a major highway for both the cargo-laden trows and the smaller wherries, which carried passengers up and down the Severn Valley. In the summer, low water levels often slowed travellers down considerably, although river transport was still faster and more comfortable than on England's virtually non-existent road network. The problem was that responsibility for roads and bridges fell on the parish in which they lay. Local ratepayers objected to forking out for repairs, and the whole system had fallen into decay. In the mid-18th century, groups of landowners began to join forces to finance improvements to stretches of road, erecting turnpike gates and toll houses to charge travellers for using them. The success of the early schemes led to large-scale turnpiking all over the country, with Worcester being an early beneficiary, lying on the main road from Birmingham to Bristol. The great age of the stagecoach had arrived, and coaching inns thrived along the route. The Old Pheasant became the principal cockfighting venue, with ample accommodation for spectators and horses, but Worcester's grandest hostelry was the Star. An inn had stood here since 1588, but the coaching days saw it rebuilt with an opulence designed to impress the many visitors passing through. In 1773, the influential nonconformist Countess of Huntingdon came to Worcester and found to her surprise she had nearly 200 followers here. She agreed to help fund a chapel for their use, and the much enlarged and restored building now stands at the heart of the Crown Gate Centre. The Georgian era brought other changes to the appearance of Worcester, with many of its medieval buildings either demolished completely and rebuilt, or refaced in the distinct architectural style so common in the city today. All Saints' Church underwent a major restoration in the same period, and in 1781 Worcester Bridge was rebuilt under the control of designer John Glynn. By now, the Three Choirs Festival, started earlier in the century, had become a world-famous event, and in 1788, King George III brought his family to Worcester to attend the annual music feast. starring the choirs of Hereford, Gloucester and Worcester cathedrals. The king stayed at the Bishop's Palace, and Farmer George, as he was affectionately known, because of his love of speaking to his subjects informally, exasperated his security guards by climbing out of his first-floor bedroom window early in the morning and wandering around town in his nightclothes, chatting cheerfully to anyone he encountered. In more appropriate attire, the king toured the Worcester porcelain works with Queen Charlotte, where they placed an order for a breakfast service. The following year, the company received their first royal charter, giving it the prestigious title of China Manufacturers to His Majesty. While the city's china makers were dealing with royalty, another of Worcester's long-established businesses was in its infancy. In 1794, a Mr. Scarrett opened a small watchmaker's shop in St. Swithin's Street. It soon prospered and moved to larger premises in Broad Street, now selling a wider range of goods. The Industrial Revolution was by now well underway, and the River Severn was set to become the greatest highway of trade and commerce in the world. The cradle of early industry was Ironbridge further upstream, and every tributary had its furnaces and forges. All needed coal, and Worcester became one of the largest distribution centres in the country. In the other direction, huge quantities of iron, pottery and other consumer goods were exported via Worcester to a commodity-hungry world. Worcester's quays were constantly busy, and rowdy watermen's taverns became a feature of the riverside. In 1815, the city's trading links were enhanced further when the Severn was linked by canal directly with the manufacturing metropolis of Birmingham. Diglas became a transshipment area where goods were transferred from the canal to the river, and the construction of huge locks and a weir on the Severn meant that the effects of its tides were no longer felt in Worcester. Meanwhile, the last traces of Worcester's long-abandoned Norman castle were removed when Castle Mount was flattened. In 1835, Lord Sandys visited a chemist shop in Broad Street to ask the proprietors, John Lee and William Perrins, to make up a recipe he had brought back from Bengal. They made some extra for themselves, but it tasted so unpleasant they consigned it to the cellar. When they rediscovered it some years later, they found it had matured into an extremely pleasant tasting sauce. They opened a factory in Bank Street, backing onto their shop to mass-produce Worcestershire sauce, as they called it, from their secret recipe, and today it graces tables all over the world. The original Walmstree House porcelain factory closed when the company joined forces with a rival firm started by Robert Chamberlain in the late 18th century. Production was consolidated on the present factory site, and the company built their own wharves at Diglas. The extensive Walmstree Riverside factory was taken over by Dent's, one of Worcester's biggest glove manufacturers. By now, a new transport revolution was about to sweep the nation. The development of the world's first railway by George Stephenson between Stockton and Darlington had attracted the interest of businessmen all over Britain, eager to invest in the new phenomenon. The railway reached Worcester in the 1850s, and in 1860 the first railway bridge was built over the Severn as the centrepiece of a 1.5 mile long viaduct, an embankment carrying the new Worcester-Hereford line. The arched spans of the 1860 bridge were replaced by the present girder bridge in 1904. The onset of the railway age brought about a decline in the traditional dominance of the river as a trading route, and gradually the Severn Trows were consigned to history. The railways, though, were excellent news for at least one Worcester businessman. Mr. W. Kilbourne Kay was quick to recognise the potential of the introduction of a fast, efficient parcel post service, and in 1886 joined forces with the watchmakers Scarrett and Company and started selling goods from catalogues and sending them out by rail. They employed a single clerk a packer and an errand boy at a small office in Foregate Street. But the huge success of Kay's mail-order business soon made it necessary to rent an adjoining 4-storey warehouse. As the century drew to a close, the company was said to have more than 6,000 agents and 250,000 customers. The end of the 19th century also saw Worcester's pioneering City Council embark on an ambitious scheme that for a time made it a national leader in the fledgling electricity industry. In 1893, they bought Powick Mills on the River Teme and constructed the first ever long-term hydroelectric power station in Britain. On October the 11th, 1894, the switch-on of the city's first 27 electric street lamps, powered by the Teme, took place, followed by a banquet in the Guildhall. As it turned out, the celebrations were a little premature. When the British Electric Traction Company applied to build an electric tramway in Worcester, it was realised that the Powick site could not possibly cope with the increased demand for power, and a new steam-powered generating station was built in Hilton Road, although Powick continued to generate electricity until 1930. Work on Worcester's electrified tram system started in the autumn of 1903. This was the biggest engineering feat the city had seen since the rebuilding of the cathedral 8 centuries earlier, and turned into a fiasco that became known as the Worcester Electric Tramway Siege. Worcester Bridge and several main streets were all dug up at the same time to lay the new tracks, causing months of widespread havoc. And to make things worse, it was the wettest autumn and winter for years. After a winter of discontent, the official opening eventually took place on February the 6th, 1904, with the first electric tram running from Worcester Bridge to Barbourne. Ironically, a new form of transport was already making its mark, and the trams would run for little more than 2 decades before motorbuses sounded their death knell. The early 20th century also saw the start of widening Worcester's ancient high street, as it began to take on an appearance familiar today. Early in April 1912, Henry Spinner, a 31-year-old Worcester glove cutter, said goodbye to his wife and 3-year-old daughter, promising he would send for them once he'd found a job and a home in the glove-making town of Gloversville, Massachusetts. It was a promise he didn't keep. The vessel he chose to take him to his new life was the ill-fated Titanic. In 1914, thousands of other young men left their hometown, these to fight with distinction in the trenches of the Western Front, and the front pages of the Borough's Worcester Journal carried reports of tragedy and heroics. The edition of December the 1st, 1917 caused particular excitement. Private Fred Dancox of Dalday was awarded the Victoria Cross for single-handedly disarming 40 German soldiers holding a key machine gun post. The announcement was greeted with great celebrations in the city, with a steady stream of well-wishers calling on Mrs. Dancox, and Dalday itself decked out to celebrate the award. A rumour started to spread like wildfire that the hero was due home on leave by a certain train on Wednesday. A huge crowd gathered at Shrub Hill Station, and people lined the streets to give him the welcome he deserved. Trains from Paddington came and went with no sign of Private Dancox, and the disappointed crowd slowly dispersed. In fact, Fred Dancox was never to see Worcester again. Borough's Journal of December the 22nd, 1917 explained why. He had been killed in action on November the 30th. While Worcester had waited to greet him, he was already dead. Other heroic actions by the Worcestershire Regiment are remembered in Worcester today. The 2nd Battalion staged what has been described as perhaps the finest exploit of any single battalion in the whole of World War I. German troops had identified a weakness in the Allied defensive line at Gellerville.
If they broke through, they would move on the Channel ports and gain the upper hand. The orders from the British generals was that the line must hold at all costs. A task that seemed impossible. The Germans flung their full might at Gellerville, and by 1 o'clock in the afternoon of October the 31st, 1914, had captured the village, killing most of the Scots Guards and the South Wales borderers defending it. Men of the 2nd Battalion of the Worcestershires had spent the night cold and bedraggled in a nearby wood, but were sent in to counterattack. For the first 600 yards, they were under cover of the woods, but then had to cross 1,000 yards of high ground to reach the chateau of Gellerville. German artillery blasted them, and at least 100 fell under the curtain of shrapnel before they reached shelter. Undaunted, they pushed on and forced the enemy from the chateau grounds. The Germans were driven out of Gellerville, giving the British time to strengthen the line, but the 2nd Worcesters suffered devastating losses, 3 officers and 189 other ranks, half their fighting men. To the Worcester Regiment, the 31st of October has since been known as Gellerville Day, and that little piece of Belgium gave its name to a little piece of Worcester. Ellen Dancox, Fred's widow, had a moment of pride in 1932 when she presented the Prince of Wales, later Edward VIII, with a wreath of Flanders poppies to lay at the War Memorial outside Worcester Cathedral. The Prince was here to officially open the widened and reconstructed River Bridge. 1934 saw a coming together of 2 of the city's historic businesses, when C.W. Dyson Perrins, the sauce magnate, acquired the Royal Worcester Porcelain Company. In February of the same year, Worcester went into mourning for one of its greatest sons. Sir Edward Elgar died at his Worcester home, aged 76, after a glittering musical career, with its roots in the city he loved. Elgar was born in this cottage in Lower Broadheath, the 4th of 7 children of William Elgar, a piano tuner and church organist. Soon after Edward was born, William opened a music shop at 10 High Street, Worcester, which became the font of Elgar's early musical inspiration. He later wrote, "A stream of music flowed through our house and shop, and I was all the time bathing in it." Elgar had strong musical links with the cathedral, firstly as a leading member of the 3 Choirs Festival Orchestra, and later performing some of his best-known works here for the first time. He was knighted in 1904, granted the Freedom of Worcester the following year, and in 1924 was appointed Master of the King's Music. Elgar is probably best known today for his popular pomp and circumstance marches, performed with such gusto at the proms, and there is no escaping his memory in Worcester. Like every other city in the country, Worcester was struggling to cope with the increasing numbers of cars, and more major physical changes took place in the 1930s, when many of the old medieval streets and narrow winding alleys around Merivale, Birdport and Little Fish Street were swept away to create Deansway. The close of the decade saw another war with Germany looming, just 21 years after the war to end all wars.
I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
Worcester was considered relatively safe, and evacuees were sent here from Birmingham. Nevertheless, precautions were taken at the cathedral to protect its historic contents, and some churches were designated as public air raid shelters. The precautions soon proved necessary when on the 3rd of October 1940, 2 bombs fell on a Worcester factory, killing 7 workers and leaving 60 injured, the first of a number of attacks on the city. In the early dark years of the war, when Britain teetered on the edge of defeat, Worcester people, rallied by the evening news, raised enough money to buy 2 Spitfires, which played their part in the successful Battle of Britain. As the war dragged on, queuing for ration books became a monotonous fact of life. Absolutely nothing was wasted. And prisoners of war became a common sight, working in the streets and fields around Worcester. Inevitably, the end was greeted with joy and gusto, all of course tinged with sadness for those who hadn't survived to celebrate. The recovery process had hardly begun, though, when Worcester was hit by the worst floods for centuries. The severe winter of 1947 added hugely to the burdens of post-war Britain. And when the thaw set in, the towns and villages along the Severn had to endure even more misery. In March, several inches of snowmelt in less than 24 hours caused a sudden swelling of the river and chaos in Worcester. The city had just about dried out when Princess Elizabeth came here in 1951 as part of her morale-boosting tour of the Midlands.
Later, a drive through the lovely city by the River Severn, its streets lined by over 100,000 loyal citizens. A stop was made at the Royal Porcelain Works, where China has been in continuous production for over 200 years. Visit to the famous cathedral.
In the large-scale rebuilding of the 60s, the old Wormstree factory was demolished to make way for the Worcester Technical College block and these retirement homes. More recently, the ancient heart of the city was swept away and replaced with the Crowngate shopping complex, although the rich history of the area has not been completely lost. Elsewhere, enough of medieval Worcester survives to provide just a taste of times past. And of course, Worcester Royal Porcelain continues to produce high-quality wares using traditional skills. Another old Worcester firm to enjoy post-war success is Kay's. With the introduction of easy payment terms and keeping abreast of changing fashions, it has gone from strength to strength. As for the cathedral, it remains locked in a time warp, a magnificent monument to Worcester's illustrious past, overlooking the river that's been its lifelong companion and the very reason for the city's existence. Only a few reminders of the Severn's heyday as a major trading highway exist, although another traditional aspect of living with a river as mighty as this is ever present. With echoes of 1947, the autumn of 1998 brought more disastrous floods, as an October of almost constant rain saw towns all along the river reaching for the sandbags as the torrent assumed frightening proportions. Acres of farmland became giant lakes. Householders close to the river had no choice but to abandon their homes, while others prayed they wouldn't have to follow. Businesses accepted the inevitable, some with resigned good humour. Crowds turned out to witness the spectacle. Normally, sure-footed creatures trod very carefully indeed, while others made hay while the rains came. In Worcester, Watergate was literally that. Pitchcroft was totally submerged. Lifeboats were on standby at the fire station. The Environment Agency worked around the clock to monitor the situation, and the term Red Alert carried ominous overtones for those closest to the river. The heyday of the strategic and commercial importance of Worcester's reason for being may have passed, but as a new millennium dawns, its ability to cause chaos is as powerful as ever.